Not quite as late here as it is for you in London right now, Phelan. So yeah, good evening to you.
Well, yeah, no, it's lovely to do this, and for context, Richard, you very kindly led similar panels with local audiences in a number of geographies with this series, ranging from Denver to London to Amsterdam. What can we hope to get out of today's panel?
Well, we're going to be talking about healthcare security, and I think that's a very critical industry to talk about right now, given everything we're dealing with COVID and attacks on our health systems during pandemic times. And I think healthcare is also a very good example of some of the challenges that other industries are facing. And I wanted to come back to Dr. Schneider's comment about disruption. Healthcare is in a very disruptive part of its evolution right now as we digitalize, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And we're also going to be asking the question of how do we secure healthcare against these overwhelming odds, and what is it going to take to get to a place of security and patient safety. So
fantastic. Well, joining Richard on this great morning or evening panel, depending, afternoon panel as well. We're joined by Mark Goudie, APJ Services Director at Crowdstrike. We've got Christopher Neal, CISO at Ramsey Health, and we've got Patricia Williams, Cisco Chair and Professor of Digital Health Systems at Flinders University. You're all very, very welcome. Richard, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Phelan. I'm just going to start and ask some of my panelists to give a few words to introduce themselves and get their vocal cords warmed up, and then we're going to get into a few testing questions here to talk about healthcare. Trish, kick us off, if you would, please.
Thanks, Richard. I'm the Professor of Digital Health Systems at Flinders University, and I run a digital health research centre and a digital health design lab. But I have 30 years experience in healthcare computing, and particularly in cybersecurity, and always looking for practical outcomes in terms of health IoT, medical devices, patient safety, and health software safety. I'm a passionate advocate and contributor to digital health, informatics, and cybersecurity standards, and I'm the co-chair of HL7 International Security Workgroup.
There we go. Thank you. We're honoured to have you with us here today. Thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us.
You haven't had any of that yet.
Well, we're looking forward to it.
You're very hopeful. You're very hopeful.
It's a preemptive comment. Put it like that.
Excellent.
Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Richard. Christopher Neal, I'm Chief Information Security Officer for Ramsey Healthcare. Operationally, I'll look after Ramsey's Australian operations, but also provide governance and oversight of for our global operations across Europe, the UK, and parts of Asia. I've been with Ramsey not quite 5 years, so a fairly limited healthcare experience, certainly compared to Professor Williams, but about 20 some years in information security, and very while only been in healthcare a little while, very passionate about how do we help the healthcare industry better understand cybersecurity and better secure our key services and secure the best outcomes for patients.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chris, for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule for you at the moment. And last but not least, or the ultimate, I should say here, Mark, over to you, sir.
Well, thanks for building it up, Richard. I hope I live up to the expectations that you've put out for me there. I've just found it rather interesting, the number of things that share in common with Chris, with about 20 something years into in the cybersecurity space, and with I think it was Gav's comments before about sticking to a price. That's one of the things that that we do at the organisation I work for, Crowdstrike, is if somebody wants to undercut us, I would say, well, have a nice day. Please let us know if your problems persist, because we'll be here to help you. So that's one of, we've got a bit of a different approach to a lot of other companies that you like to hit a price, rather we strive for outcomes. So without going into too much detail, I've been doing cybersecurity for about 20 years across, been doing incident response for about the last 12 years. Worked for a number of the larger organizations, and I've head up the incident response and digital forensics and cybersecurity practice for Crowdstrike across Asia Pacific and Japan.
Cool, great. Well, we're glad to have you with us to share your wisdom, Mark, as well. I'm sure there's going to be quite a few points that we're going to be probing you quite deeply on, if you'll pardon the phrase. So, and last but not least, I'm Richard Staynings. Like everyone else on the panel, I've got about 25 years in the healthcare cybersecurity space, long before we called it healthcare. Well, long before we called it cybersecurity. I think we called it healthcare for a long time, actually. But the healthcare today is very different from the healthcare of yesterday. And my first question I'd like to direct to Trish to kind of talk us through what's been happening in the healthcare space. Obviously the telehealth, telemedicine, digitalization of healthcare has had a major impact. And at the same time, there's been a lot of technological changes going on the back end that, may have had some impact on our ability to secure the industry.
Thanks, Richard. That's a good question to start us off with. I think there's probably four main areas that have really seen that digital evolution in healthcare. I think our increasing appetite for being able to share information, and obviously to be able to do that, you need interoperability. And a lot of that between healthcare provider organizations and through the development of international standards like HL7 FHIR that have allowed that transfer of information interoperability to happen in healthcare around the world has changed enormously over the last 5 to 10 years. But we can't go past the major shift due to COVID. Whilst there was, telehealth was around the world being used, not adopted as quickly as we might have liked, and certainly driven by the COVID pandemic. And it's seen the delivery or the transformation to virtual care services. And so up until 2020, it was ingrained in part of, for instance, the Australian culture to receive healthcare in a very face-to-face setting, in a provider's clinics and a hospital or rooms. But the COVID-19 panic certainly was an unprecedented interloper in that. And it shifted our culture in many ways, not least in our societal expectations and understanding of how we receive healthcare. And virtual care does have a huge role to play in the future of healthcare, with the right care, right place at right time, very much geared around the patient rather than about the provider delivery. So that's certainly made a huge shift, I think, around the world. But there are other newer areas, for instance, like the growth of AI, and particularly in clinical decision making. Radiology and imaging has changed, or is much more specific now, and you can diagnose things much quicker using AI. And we have had clinical decision support systems of all sorts for many years, but that's becoming something that is very new and less known about, because we don't necessarily know what's going on inside the black box algorithms that are producing that decision support. And I think the fourth thing is the large and massive growth in medical devices, and not just fully blown clinical grade medical devices, but the fact that many of those are moving into the community or home environment, and also having your personal monitoring devices, and indeed software as a medical device where your phone can do many of those things as well. And in that mobile transition, we have a big challenge in cybersecurity, because we no longer have the same encompassed control that we used to have. So I think all those things will certainly change how we look at the environment that we're in healthcare.
Yeah, it's certainly a much more technology intensive delivery model today than when I started in the healthcare space. It's changed significantly from matrons and wandering around the hospitals to to a massive influx of medical devices that are next to the patient bed, right? Whether you're in the A&E in an A&E bed, or whether you're in ICU. I mean, the number of and sophistication of technological tools and devices has gone through the roof. Yeah.
I think that because those devices too, when they were first used, were fairly standalone and had older type operating systems and embedded software, and now we want all of them to be connected all of the time, and that poses us a whole different set of problems. Right.
And Chris, I want to throw this over to you. You're obviously on the the hard edge here, right? Having to deal with this, having to secure Ramsay Health Australia. How are you dealing with this rise in digitalization, interoperability, and influx of medical devices?
And it's a challenge, no question. And part of it is helping clinical staff and frontline hospital staff understand these are computers. And to Professor Williams' point, 10 years ago, these were standalone devices. They didn't talk to anything. That was fine. Now, everything with a PowerPoint is both a computer and connected to everything else. And understanding what that means in terms of how they need to take care of them, what they need to consider about how they're deployed, where they're connected, is a challenge. Many of the biomedical engineers who look after this equipment don't necessarily understand any of this. And I won't say are hostile. They're not hostile, most certainly, but it's a change of understanding for them, right? They're coming from, quite rightly, they're all about availability and making sure devices work as intended. They're not used to thinking about what are the unintended uses, what are the malicious use cases, and how do we mitigate those, both in terms of frontline biomedical staff, but often, and I know others have this challenge, device manufacturers, particularly some of the global manufacturers. Their product teams will understand this, but their product teams are based in the US, and their local teams often don't have that knowledge. So if our biomedical teams are going to the local arm of an international medical device manufacturer, I'm trying not to name one,
there's plenty to choose from. There's hundreds of thousands of them by now.
There's lots, yes. If our biomedical team's going to the local sales arm asking about deployment options, they're not going to get cybersecurity concerns or considerations in any of that response. That's when my team needs to get involved. I need to help them educate. I've actually hired a biomedical engineer, and I'm training him in cybersecurity, specifically to have those conversations. So I figured it was easier to train cyber into a biomed than train a cyber person in biomed. But it's about working through, okay, how do we test, and not just test the standard use cases? What are the malicious use cases? Where could things go wrong, and how do we test those edge cases before we deploy to a patient?
Right. So is there a conceptual lens problem here, in that clinical engineering and biomed staff tend to see things through an operational lens, whereas security tends to have an entirely different view? To what extent have you seen the convergence of the BMETs and the clinical engineers on one side of the hospital with IT and security on the other side? Is that happening in your experience, or are we still a long way from that eventuality?
I haven't seen that anywhere in Australia. It may be happening other places, but I certainly haven't seen it here. It's still very much separate camps. And I look at energy sector and other ICS, industrial operational networks. It's not happening there to a material extent in a lot of cases there. In any case, right? And healthcare, I would suggest, is trailing those industries right. on this question, at least, right? By probably 5 to 10 years.
Right. And is it also, true to suggest that perhaps there's a third-party element here of managing all of those third-party vendors that manufacture devices and systems? I mean, we've seen recently, the SolarWinds attack, a software supply chain attack. We've seen the impact of that right the way across the world. to large organization that run, the Orion software. Is that a concern for Ramsey or for you, as a CISO in this space?
It's generally a concern for every healthcare CISO I know.
Right.
It's for a number of reasons. As I said, many of the manufacturers don't necessarily understand the detail here. They're particularly the US-based ones are a little further ahead because the FDA and HIPAA have pushed them to be further ahead, to be frank. Local ones are trailing, and the local teams are still trailing as well. But the challenge is keeping them on the journey and helping them understand, here's what this risk looks like, and here's what I need from you in order to understand what the risk is, right? The number of times I've gone to a local pre-sale, local sales arm of a manufacturer and asked, okay, this vulnerability has been announced. Is your product affected?
Right.
And they can't answer the question. And half the time, at best, a number of weeks or a couple of months later, I'll get an answer out of their U.S. engineering team. And it's those kind of gaps we need to work as an industry to close, right? There's some work, certainly, the FDA is doing good stuff in the U.S. And that is starting to drive some change in behavior, but it's a long way to go. And then there's the whole question of just managing third party risk in terms of the vendors managing the equipment in my hospital, and how do I govern that? The traditional third party risk problem. Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. Mark, I want to throw this over to you. With all of these new endpoints, being connected now, as Trish said, to the healthcare network. I read a report recently that said something like 2/3 of the IP addresses that are being used in a hospital now go to unmanaged devices. By that, BYOD devices, guest devices, and a lot of biomedical clinical engineering devices now. How is that changing the threat surface? And what are you seeing from your perspective in terms of how, perpetrators of cyber attacks are capitalizing on that?
Yeah, interesting question, Richard. I think just pick up on a couple of threads that were spoken on, that were discussed by Chris and Patricia before. I think that the critical one that Chris mentioned was availability. So availability is, in any time there's operating technology or healthcare technology, availability of that device is critical to the patient outcome. So that's usually what trumps confidentiality and integrity in that circumstance. What we've seen in the last 12 months is this massive rise in the incidents of ransomware. Like, we've seen a 300% increase in the amount of ransomware that's been deployed across all industries, including healthcare. So if you put the circumstance out for, the theoretical circumstance of having a ransomware incident in a healthcare setting could have disastrous outcomes when you've got this massive increase of ransomware that's being executed across all industries, including health. But the double-edged sword now with ransomware is that they don't just affect the availability of your data, but if you think about a world where you've got PHI data, if that gets compromised, the ransomware actors will now extort you and threaten to publish sensitive information if you don't pay. So there's now this double ransom effect of really trying to get the victim to be paying up. And it's not just affecting healthcare; it affects everybody. But I think the impact in the health industry is going to be a lot more dramatic than many others.
Right. And we saw that last year in Germany, right, with a poor woman who died as a result of the unavailability of health IT systems at Düsseldorf University Hospital following a ransomware attack. So it's a good lesson to bring up there that availability integrity and confidentiality of information all need protecting at the same time. But some have greater impact, shall we say, on society and individuals impacted than others, right? Which is a huge concern.
Richard, I think. Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead.
I think one of the things that Mark, highlights there is that changing threat surface is not just changing to be outside of the organization, it's changing what it looks like completely. So,
right.
Whether it is now that medical devices are connecting, and, traditionally medical devices would often be on a separate network in a hospital, and certainly segmented, and some of them are now not and are wireless. And so it actually changes what you're trying to protect as well inside as much as outside. And that just changes how we look at cybersecurity, for healthcare completely. And that's a really big sort of cultural shift.
Absolutely, right. I mean, hospital firewalls now look like Swiss cheese, right?
Yeah.
And we are so interconnected with, public health reporting, pharmacy, prescriptions going in and out, to a proliferation of different, suppliers of healthcare, and obviously the private insurers as well. And of course, we now have these, right? My Health Record on your cell phone, right? So it's it's an entirely different paradigm. Yeah.
It is.
Chris, how are you dealing with that? Is that a concern for your executives? Do they sleep at night?
They try to make it my problem so I don't sleep at night. And I do my best to share the insomnia. It's certainly a concern. Our environment was already quite segmented. We are actually taking further steps to segment it further, specifically to deal with those sort of attacks. And to pick up on Mark's point earlier about sort of the ransomware crews attacking the victims, there's been at least one case where they've gone the next step. There was a Finnish mental health facility that they were ransomware. Their data was stolen. The ransomware crew threatened the healthcare, the mental health facility. It was a complex of facilities. When they didn't pay, they then took the clinical notes from the psychologists and threatened the patients directly.
Wow.
That's a new low, I've got to say, Chris.
It is, really, no question, but they're criminals, right? If we expect them to operate by moral norms, we're
sorry, my bad.
No. It is a new low. Don't worry, right? And deeply disturbing, but one we need to. I think we need to be expecting they'll go go wherever they can to make a buck. But it's as Ramsey particularly further digitizes, as we look to drive more online and more connected and more sharing, right? We want to share information, and the healthcare professionals, as a general statement, want to share information with other healthcare professionals to get the best outcomes for patients. How we do that in a secure way is one of the key conversations. The executive team has, the board has, and how we do that is critical to how we move forward.
Right. I wanted to bring up. I wanted to talk about one point that you raised there, and you talked about segmentation. Is this, given the proliferation of devices and the fact that the items being attached to our healthcare networks, everything from cell phones right the way through to medical devices and X-ray machines and BYOD laptops that are being connected now. How do we go about understanding what assets are connected, understanding the risks they present, and then segmenting them in such a way that it doesn't impede the delivery of healthcare services?
My answer is, if you're more than a 20-bed hospital, go invest in the tool. Well, your best hope, and you may not have a lot of hope, but your best hope is go buy the tools.
Right.
There aren't. I won't name any tool, but there's a number of different. There's a variety of products. Some are better than others, but there's a variety of products that will help you understand what's connected. And if you're more than a 20-bed hospital, trying to manually keep track of what's connected to your hospital network, you haven't got a hope.
Yeah,
you really haven't, right? As soon you need to acknowledge, you need to understand that, acknowledge that, and then, okay, what tooling, what process am I going to put in place to help me keep track of it?
Right.
You know, when we did that a couple of years ago, we discovered, not a huge surprise, but it did wake up the executive some. We had about 3 times as many non-PC devices connected to our network,
right,
as traditional PCs, and that's not counting the environment, the networks we make available for patients to connect
right,
phones
right.
and tablets and stuff to, right? That we don't particularly look at that, right? We make sure they can't attack each other and then let them do what they want, because we have no business inspecting what they're doing. But just on the network of stuff we manage, 3 times as many non-medical or non-PC devices as PCs.
Right. Are you seeing that too, Trish? In your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And trying to, I mean, there's an essence of, can you actually control everything that is within your network? And I don't think that you can. You have to have other ways of being able to look at how to protect the network as a whole, and the devices. And I think part of that also moves on to, how do you get hospitals and governments probably to see how big the problem is. So when we have ransomware attacks in Australia and they get into the news, then people start to take notice. But we have to remember that technology doesn't deliver healthcare, people do.
Right.
And it's very difficult to say people have to do things, clinicians have to do things in a certain way because of cybersecurity aspects, because trying to fit that into workflow is very hard in healthcare. And it's not like banking, where we can say, well, you can't get onto your bank account, Rich, unless you do this. You just can't do that in healthcare. And so that integration is really highly important within our environment, and something that I think most of us in cybersecurity and health had to try and work at a long time to try and help make that easier for healthcare to actually do cybersecurity, because not all of the solutions are technical.
Right, right. Yeah, we've got bigger implications when systems fail in healthcare than in banking systems. It's an inconvenience in banking, and you can insure against losses. It's a bit hard to insure against grandma, if she gets assassinated, in the emergency room, right? Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it's a human dynamic.
I don't think we like to refer to it as assassinating your grandma in emergency, Richard. I think that's just going a bit far.
Yeah,
certainly not the approved term.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mark, we've obviously got a visibility and a sponsorship problem here. From what Trish and Chris are saying, is this, are these problems now to the point? The threats that we're facing from nation state actors, from organized cybercrime, that may go after grandma, or certainly go after your psych records, right? Is this now too much for individual hospitals to deal with? Does it make sense for them to continue as they've been doing, or do we need to think outside of the box to protect our patients and our institutions?
Yeah, I think like Chris was saying, I think there's a scale issue that needs to be discussed. But generally, I'd say most healthcare businesses or organizations operate more like a small to medium enterprise organization, and that very few of them have the dedicated staff that's necessary to prevent, detect, and respond to threats in a rapid enough fashion. We just saw the Hafnium, or the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability just a few weeks ago. I remember it quite well because the announcement came out about the vulnerability on my birthday. The day after, we've got businesses all over the world that are being exploited because of the rapid rise in which the threat was able to move on from being something that was conducted by a nation state to then being conducted by e-crime groups all at the same time. And if we look across the range of organisations that our threat intelligence team have been affected, there's a huge number of small to medium enterprises, healthcare providers, councils, governments, and all of these organisations don't have the ability to patch in a fast, in a rapid fashion when a critical vulnerability comes out. So, the model that we've adopted with one of our teams is we put a policy in place where Crowdstrike will actively go in and remediate the threat on the client's behalf as it happens. So it's not days, weeks, and months before the malicious activity is terminated. It's minutes, and we're able to fix that up straight away, because these breaches, like, they do happen quickly, but they happen in hours, they happen in days, and before they escalate into something that really causes significant damage to the organisation. So that's where we like to head it off, whilst it's in the initial stages of the attack. I think that's something that should be adopted more widely around healthcare industry and all industries, frankly. If you can't do that yourself and have a team that's going to be operating in a 24/7, 365 days a year model, which is now required, then give that responsibility to someone that can not only detect it, they can also do something about it, such that you don't end up coming in and on Monday morning to a giant mess that you can't fix in a hurry.
Right. Yeah. There's no such thing as waiting 30 days for the Microsoft patch cycle to get tested before you implement it. Certainly today, anyway. So I tend to agree with you. So just to wind up here, we've got a very dynamic, very complex, very changing healthcare environment using ever increasing levels of technology. We've got challenges in terms of how to secure that morass of technology, of network connected technologies, using the staff and the budgets that we have. And generally executives, whether they're government or private, that don't necessarily prioritize cybersecurity to the degree that perhaps they should do, given the risks at stake here, and the inability to dynamically address risks and problems quickly enough in order to remediate those risks before they become significant problems. Yeah.
I like it. Well, Richard, this is a tour de force panel that we could keep on going on with, and that's the testament to your panel leadership and our panelists, of course, but also the topic. So I really like this. It's very, very current. Of course, there's many subsectors of security we could go down, but healthcare is very much flavor of the moment, or flavor of the month. So please, Richard, thank you very much for leading a great panel. Give our wonderful panelists, Mark, Patricia, and Christopher, a great round of applause virtually. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Phelan, for inviting us, and thanks to some great panelists that made this possible.
I will see you soon.
Thank you, Neal.